Welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe. My name is Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
Peter Chung is the man of the hour today, man, the creator of Eon Flux, and surprisingly, like a whole lot of our childhoods and young adulthoods, up to my early 20s for sure, man. Let's jump into things right away. Peter, thank you so much. When we chatted last, I asked you about the soundtrack and the music of Eon Flux because the question I had was like, you know, MTV, very famous limited budget, did like 70% of that go to the soundtrack to have an orchestra? And you revealed that it was one guy, Drew Newman, who did it all. And two, there was a soundtrack forthcoming that you were excited about. Took a couple of years, but it's finally here.
Yeah, so I was wondering, how did you get a hold of the box set? Did Waxwork reach out to you, or how did that happen?
Yeah, they just sent it to us. We did a couple episodes with Eastman and Laird, the creators of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Kevin Eastman has been doing work with them by doing album art and things for these movie soundtracks, doing fresh Turtles artwork there. He reached out and told us the guy at Waxwork mentioned that, and I was like, you know what, we need Peter Chung back on the channel. We need to desperately find a way to get
Yes.
Uncle Pete on the channel again, and they sent us this box set, which is just freaking beautiful, man. Did you have any hand in doing the design work on this thing?
Yeah, it was a big collaboration. So Drew Newman, just out of the blue, he called me and let me know that they were doing a box set soundtrack, which had never been released before. And so I thought, what's typical in a lot of these cases is that somebody just wants you to do them a favor by providing artwork. And I don't know you're both artists. People ask you to draw stuff for them, and they think that it's it's easy for you, and they want you to do them a favor.
Right.
And I was a little reluctant at first. I thought it was going to be one of these things like, okay, what are these people looking for? I mean, I've got some pieces of artwork from the show, production stuff that hadn't been published before. And I said, well, I can just offer him this stuff. But then he said that I looked at their catalog, and, they have real budgets and real production values in terms of the way that they create these collections for real diehard fans of they do a lot of obscure horror movies and release the soundtracks for old TV shows. And so, when they said they wanted to do this, I said, well, yeah, be a great chance to show off a lot of this stuff, because a lot of the artwork, frankly, that I do in development just never gets seen by anybody.
Yeah.
So it was a chance to share that. I mean, I'm doing a little bit of that on Instagram, sharing a lot of the unpublished work. But this was a chance to do something, in a full package, and it would be a real kind of archival collector's item.
It's absolutely beautiful. Like the production, it seems like they went all out. Are you pretty happy with how it turned out?
Yeah, I'm very happy. Well, it's funny because at the beginning it was just going to be the 6 discs, and then they decided they wanted, because I was giving them all this artwork, and they said, well, we should put together a booklet.
Yeah.
And the booklet started out being, I think it was 16 pages at first, and it turned into 24, and then eventually, it ended up being 40 pages.
Was stuff like the storyboards here? Did anybody ever see this? Was this ever published on paper for the public?
No, it did show up online for a couple of interviews that I've done over the years, but not printed and released on something you could buy.
It's such an amazing document to have. Certainly as Peter Chung fans, to see your actual hand. Animation, very collaborative process. But to see the things that you put down on paper, and I do wonder, there's several names that are mentioned here as people who are drawing different eons and things. And so like a piece like this, is this you?
Yeah, that's an old sketch, but I just cleaned it up and finished it recently. I wanted to put it up on my Instagram, but it was just a pencil sketch that I had lying around. And like a lot of stuff, I enjoy the the conceptual part of it. I don't really enjoy the finishing, making a finished illustration, because it's a lot of painstaking, and I feel like I don't have a steady enough hand to ever be an illustrator. The great thing about being an animator is you can do a lot of rough drawings, and you can just kind of leave them rough, and somebody else will come around and clean them up, which is what I like to do, which is what I think a lot of animators like to do. And but working on a Cintiq, it allows me to do kind of pseudo inking. I mean, digital inking.
Yeah.
Because I could never, I would never be able to ink something traditionally.
Sure.
My hand just isn't steady enough to do that.
Where was this picture taken?
That, that's an old picture, but at one of the studios where I was, I might have been working on a commercial at the time, but it was in the middle of production at an animation studio in Korea.
Just so cool to see all this stuff. Are these the original designs?
Some of them are, yes. Some of them are absolutely from the original model sheets. And, because it was a small production, very often what happens in animation studios is that they'll start off with a couple of model sheets, turnarounds of the characters just to show what the costume looks like. But then as scenes get animated, then poses that are being used in the animation that are particularly useful end up being used as model sheets. So some of those poses are scenes that ended up on film, which then got turned around and turned into model sheets.
It's a very complex character, especially when you start getting into the how the gizmos on the knees work and things. There's a lot of stuff to wrap around this character in 3 dimensions. It's extremely ambitious work.
Well, I find that you need to keep pushing your ability to draw, especially to turn things in space. And the more you do it, if you're doing it all day long, you get really good at it. And so I don't know how it is with you guys, but at the beginning of the day, I have to draw a lot of bad drawings, for about an hour or 2 hours before I start to produce anything good. But then at the end of the day, after you've been drawing for 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours, then, you feel like you can draw anything. And, it's that constant need to exercise basic drawing muscles, put it that way. The problem I have with a lot of TV animation is that they dumb down the model sheets to make them things that anybody can draw. Right. Even people who don't have any drawing ability, they can still draw them. They're almost like foolproof character designs. And I just feel like you're never going to get better as a draftsman if you're only going to draw stuff that never challenges you.
It does seem like you always push yourself too. There's very few morsels of interviews with Peter Chung on the net. Very few in video, but you could find some in text and things. And early on with Eon Flux, this is after Rugrats and some of that other stuff that you were doing before then, which those character designs, it's so cool to see your designs for like Tommy Pickles and things, because you have to draw through. Like that's a part of the animation process, is drawing through and seeing how you put those characters together. But then I remember seeing parts where you're talking about you were done, like, I'm done with babies. Like I need to stretch these characters. I need to draw some adults, and with limbs that can actually grab a doorknob and things like that. And then when it came time to do, I guess it's season 3 is when we start to get to talkies with Eon Flux. The conversation you would have, at least in some of the interviews, would be you were like done with the violence. You did a lot of really cool action stuff in the silent episodes. And MTV seemed to lean on let's amp up the sex, let's tone down the violence, and you were super excited about that. You were sort of done with the action part, so it always seemed like you're always pushing for something new, maybe even a little restless.
Well, actually, it was much more the idea of it needing to be able to engage a viewer without being well animated, because I know from experience from working in TV animation for years before doing Eon Flux, is that the animation is never going to live up to, you know, what you have in your mind. And so I just kind of gave up the idea that we were going to have a lot of great animation in the show, and so I really focused on the writing, in terms of creating interesting structures and creating interesting, ways of telling a story that would be oriented to an adult audience. Well, here's the thing: is because, you know, actually, Eon Flux was the first scripted adult non-comedy dramatic series. So there was a lot of discussion at the time about what made something an adult show. And, you know, the most obvious answer that most people gave was that, well, you know, it just has to have more graphic sex and violence. And to me, that was never my approach. I never thought that what made something more adult was it had more sex and violence, you know. And there's a lot of examples of, I think, you know, very juvenile stories. Just because they have a lot of graphic sex and violence doesn't make them more adult. It's just more graphic, but they're still children's stories. So the thing that I focused on was things which you could never do, telling stories for kids, which involved a lot of moral ambiguity and characters having to, well, first of all, you know, not defining a hero and a villain and good versus evil, and making every situation, every story, in a sense, define its own morality. I was thinking about that a lot. I was thinking a lot about how the same character could be somebody that you identify with, or that you oppose, depending on how you interpret their actions. And I know this sounds very academic and very kind of...
It's what the channel's about. Don't even question yourself. Keep going.
Yeah, so I was looking at a lot of... at the time, I was very influenced by the writings of Dashiell Hammett. And I was taking a lot of inspiration from a lot of his way of having characters do things that you think are motivated by one goal, but as the story progresses, the intent or the goal or the motivation shifts. And not only does it shift in terms of what the character needs to do, but also in terms of how the reader or how the audience perceives their motives. And those are things that, you know, you can't play around with when it comes to telling a story for kids, because it will just confuse them. But I you know, I try to put as much of that as possible into the show. I think that in some cases it backfired, because I think that a lot of people tuning in who are just expecting to watch a half hour of fun animation, you know, found the stories confusing, and maybe even thought that it was the fault of the director, me. There was even at the time a review. There weren't that many reviews in newspapers, but there was one that came out in the LA Times which said that the director was lazy because he hadn't figured out who was good and who was bad in the story.
Peter, how do you, when you see a criticism like that, and it sort of reflects your intent that you didn't want to define these characters as good and evil, and yet it's kind of a negative, you know, it's a criticism. How does that make you feel? Do you kind of go like, well, I did what I wanted. This person didn't like it, but...
Well, you know, I'm not like a lot of people who say that they don't read reviews. I read reviews, and I read discussions whenever something of mine is released. I'm very much interested in the the feedback I get from viewers, and what you find is that there's always going to be people who hate your stuff for one reason or another, and they'll always come up with a way of coming up with rhetoric to defend their dislike, and that's fine, because I'll be very honest, I can be the same way. I think that the reason why people like things or dislike things in the end does not have very much to do with rational reasons. It's an emotional response, and then they use their rhetoric as a way of justifying their emotional response. But that's I'm trying to remember the exact quote. I think it was Kafka who said, "It is not wisdom that men seek, but rather the justification for what they happen to cherish." And yeah, I think that's true.
When you're coming up with such a revolutionary kind of series, and you are playing with ambiguities, and there are themes that start to show up over the course of episodes and things. How, when you're writing these, I believe you wrote like 8 out of 10 for the. I think you had some extra help doing an episode or two. Like, how do you hedge against pretense? Do you have a lot of people that you trust around?
Well, that's a difficult thing to answer simply. That's a very complicated. I mean, I could spend an hour just talking about just that, because there are so many factors that go into what makes you decide to tell a story a certain way. And for me, I always try to start from theme. I think about, and this is the way I teach storytelling as well, is that I imagine the experience that I want the audience, the viewer, to have, especially at the end of watching something that I've done. So at the end of an episode, what is the feeling or state of mind that I want to leave my audience in? And then, in a sense, I try to reverse engineer whatever kind of series of events is going to bring about that state of mind, which is the thing that you're trying to achieve. One thing that I tell my students is that, don't focus on the period of time when your audience is watching your film, because in the case of students, it might be just 5 minutes if they're making a student short. Or for the TV episode, it might be 11 minutes for a kid's show, or it could be 22 minutes. But even if it's 22 minutes, it's just 22 minutes. And, don't focus on just those 22 minutes or 5 minutes. Because after those minutes are over, then, if all you're focused on is the time when your film is on the screen for, then you're really selling yourself short, because it's the time after the film is finished playing and the viewer is left thinking or remembering the experience that they had. That's what I care about, and that's what I tell my students to focus on. Is how's the experience of watching your film going to affect them after the film has been turned off? And I think the same thing should apply to, maybe it's a little bit different for things like paintings or books or illustrations. I think it's the fact that film is an ephemeral medium, is in the sense that it unfolds in time, and that you can't really grasp any particular image. It flashes on the screen and then it's gone. And I think that in a way that's what appeals to me about it, in the sense that it has an elusive quality to it, which I think that, I think we talked about this a little bit. Like when I do illustrations, I feel like what I drew on the page is what you get. But I feel like when I make a film, what you get is not what you drew on the page. It's something else. It's something, the interaction of all the different elements, sound and color and movement, creates an impression that is more than the sum of its parts.
As we go through this, Peter, if any of these images or episode recaps and things call anything to mind, please let us know. Like, one of the questions I had from reading this book was how much did you inform Drew Newman in a direction to go, or did you have a vision for the sound before he came on board?
I trusted Drew completely. I mean, he has a background in animation and filmmaking before he turned to music, and so he's really he's really a storyteller in the way he uses sound. And the first Liquid TV shorts that we did, he not only did the music, he did all the sound design. And he went out and he recorded like real live guns, and he recorded animal sounds. He went all over the place with his tape recorder and just created a library. And he was fairly new to scoring animation, and so he, just like me, I was just trying every aspect of doing a show, because normally if you're doing a TV show, you're not animating and you're not designing characters. You're handing off a lot of that stuff to other people. But in the same sense that I just wanted to have my hand in everything. Drew was the same way, and so I just kind of, to answer your question, I just left him alone to come up with his way of doing it, and he would play back things, and in general everything was great. I never gave him any kind of notes. Whenever he just understood, we were just on the same wavelength. He just understood what I was trying to do, and he understood what it required. And then when he played it back to me, it was always way better than what I could have imagined or what I could have asked for. And that's the best kind of collaboration.
You mentioned your students, and I feel like when we did our first shoot interview, it's almost like we mistimed things, because you didn't have a Patreon at that moment, but you do now, and it was released very soon after we did the shoot interview. So is that where some of your students get your guidance?
Well, I do have I do have one tier of on my Patreon where people can have one-on-one discussions with me, and they show me their work, and I give them critiques. But that's not most of them. I mean, most of them are just interested in supporting my work, and I'm developing an original animated series, and I'm trying to launch it independently, and so I need some support to be able to achieve that.
Tell everybody what that Patreon is. Like, I want to see this film, so we need to support Peter Chung on this quest.
Well, it's just Patreon/Peter Chung. So it's pretty easy to find. The lowest donation is $5 a month, and it goes up to $100. At $100 a month, you get an original signed animation cell that was actually used in production, and those are running out. So, and I'm not adding any more to the catalog, because the best pieces are being auctioned off. So it's a rare chance to be able to get some original art, at I think a very fair price.
$100 is a steal for something like that. And there's some friends showing up on Instagram who are showing off their cells and stuff.
Peter, do you think some of the success of Eon Flux, like you've talked about Drew Newman having, kind of new to this but doing everything himself, and you did a lot of this yourself, I wonder do you think that's a contributing factor to Eon Flux having the longevity it's had, to having the quality that it is, that you're kind of a small team and your hands are really all over it?
Yeah, I think that's true for any kind of animated show, animated product, or even any kind of artistic series that gets remembered and makes a mark, is that it really bears the stamp of the original creator. There's an identifiable sensibility. when I see films of filmmakers that I like, you feel at the end of them that you know that person, even though you've never met them. And I kind of wanted to give that kind of experience to my viewer, in the sense that maybe it's strange that it's considered an unorthodox way to approach making TV shows, but it always has to come from someplace personal, and it's the exception these days when somebody points to somebody's work and says, "Oh, well, this seems really personal. What you're doing seems really personal," and that should be the norm. And I don't know why that's considered such a rare trait for a lot of commercial entertainment, but sadly it is.
When we last spoke, and you were talking about maybe launching a Patreon, whatever, you also were talking about NFTs as being a possible source of income, and that ain't happening.
Yeah. So that was, it's funny, because I was talking earlier about using rhetoric to justify something that you like, and obviously, the idea of NFTs is it's a way of making money, and I actually, my first reaction to the idea of NFTs is that this is completely stupid and backward, and it's just this completely made up. Because it's the idea is that you're not really actually buying anything when you buy an NFT. You're just buying the proof that you own something, but the thing that you own is not actually owned by you. It's something that's freely available to everybody, because we're talking about digital artwork. But a friend of mine, Robert Valley, had some success selling NFTs, and so I looked at his work and some other artists whose work I admired, and they were doing it, and I thought, well, maybe there's a way of thinking about this that would make it make sense to me. And what I ended up with on that is I really don't think that most of the platforms that are selling NFTs are going about it the right way, because what they're doing is that they're treating it like traditional art, in the sense that what they're doing is they're releasing new pieces and offering them for sale on the day that they release them, and that's wrong. That's not the way to sell NFTs. The thing to do is to create art, release it into the wild, let it go viral, and build up a demand for it. Create images that some people are going to download and put on their T-shirt, or tattoo on their arm or whatever, and to the point where I say this because I see some of the things that I've made, like the Eon Flux, the eye, that you just showed in the storyboard. There are people on Instagram with tattoos of that. That's a viral image that I created.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, I don't have the rights to it because MTV owns it. But if I could create a viral image that had that kind of demand, if I had the rights, the ownership of that image, and I could sell the NFT of it, then it would be valuable to people, because it's something that a lot of people want and a lot of people recognize. It doesn't make sense to offer an NFT of an image that nobody has ever seen, which is what a lot of these galleries are doing, these platforms are doing.
Sure.
So that was my strategy, which was to create images or clips, because some of the Robert Valley pieces are actually animation clips. And so I was thinking about creating these animation clips and posting them online, maybe on YouTube or maybe on Instagram. And the challenge would be to create something that would cause somebody to look at it and want to share it, because that's how something goes viral. So if you can create an image or create a clip that immediately makes somebody want to share it, then you would create a demand. And then it would make sense to then, after months or, maybe even years, is then offer somebody ownership of that clip. And that's the only way it would make sense to me. But but with the whole collapse of crypto, I mean, I've stopped thinking about it. But that was my idea.
Whenever we see these like the storyboards that are in here, what does that represent? Do you have like 100 times this many storyboards? Like, is there a giant volume potentially of these storyboards, like a huge collection that could be made?
Well, I posted a lot of my storyboards on Instagram. I do a lot of rough storyboards, which I wouldn't release. And they're not. The idea behind storyboards is I used to collect storyboards from artists that I liked, because especially when I was working on Transformers, very often the storyboards would look way better than the finished episodes. And it was just I always felt like it was a shame that the artwork, the output of these very talented artists, the storyboard artists, was never ever going to get seen by the public. And so storyboards are, I think that there's a lot more interest these days in it, because just the availability of the process of animation making to everybody. There's tons of tutorials and there are books of how animation is made. I'm not sure exactly what your question was. Like, are there a lot of stacks of storyboards? Yes, there are.
I think we'd like to see those in a book form.
Yeah, I want a 400-page version of this book, I guess is what I'm asking.
I'm kind of ambivalent about that, because the storyboards are they're very much misunderstood by a lot of people who don't, and even people working in animation, I find don't have a true appreciation of what makes a good storyboard, because a storyboard can look beautiful on the page, doesn't mean it's a good storyboard.
There were examples of that. I was listening to the audio commentary of Eon Flux, and you were talking about commissioning Paul Gulacy, famous comic artist, to do storyboards, and we were looking during that episode, and then you said, we had to reboard all of it. Yeah.
I mean, I would have thought that Paul Gulacy, looking at his comics, because his comics are very, very cinematic, and sometimes they do flow like storyboards. I mean, he's from the whole Steranko school of visual storytelling. Him and the other comic book artist, actually, we hired a few comic book artists. John Watkiss was another one, and Eric Canetti, and he ended up being really good. But for the most part, it wasn't something that translated into something that would work on film. And so a lot of people just looking at a storyboard, this is one of the things that I teach, is that if there's something interesting in every panel of your storyboard, it's not going to be interesting when you see it on film. And in order for something to play well on film, your storyboard has to include shots of nothing. You have to be able to use negative space. And the problem I have with it's time-based negative space, in the sense that you're creating silences in the same way that a composer uses silence to give emphasis to certain moments in their composition. Film works the same way. And so I suppose you could look at a storyboard and just appreciate it for its own qualities as a series of breaking down an action through a series of pictures, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make a good piece of film.
Sure. One of the things that fascinated me too, listening to the audio commentary track, was that you guys sometimes had a hard time remembering if something cool that was happening in the film was a discovery of the storyboard artist, or if it was actually written into the script. So,
well, that happens. I mean, that always happens. That's always going to happen.
Yeah.
So, a lot of animated shows these days, especially a lot of the gag-based shows, they're not scripted.
Right.
The storyboard artists are just handed an outline, and then maybe they have a discussion with the director, and then the storyboard artist just comes up with a lot of most of the business, most of the things that the characters are actually going to do. I don't like working that way. I think that it's very inefficient, and you can kind of get lost, wasting time doing things, creating interesting bits of action or business that don't fit into a coherent narrative. So I always write everything down to a very, very fine level of detail, even if it's just purely visual. Like, for example, the Eon Flux pilot, that was all scripted. It was like a 20-page script where every single little thing, like every single time she lifted her gun and turned her head, it was all written down.
You mentioned Robert Valley, and I'm pretty sure he worked on Eon Flux a little bit.
He did a lot of work on it.
Okay, and I'm wondering, you hear this often on commentary tracks when it comes to animation, where the producers are in there, and they could identify artwork because there's a guy who's great at effects, there's a dude who's good at guns, there's a guy who draws the girls better, like this and that. Are there some names that you could call out? Like, what did Robert Valley do as opposed to your general guys? Who were the cool effects men?
Well, Robert is a director, and so he was a storyboard artist. That's what he did on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And he eventually directed one of the episodes, sort of co-directed it with me, but he basically directed it. And by directing, when it comes to TV animation, storyboarding it is maybe 80% of what a director does. So I did have people on the crew who were especially good at certain things, drawing characters. You know the comic artist Tony Salmons?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he worked on the show as a character designer, and I had a Japanese animator named Osamu Tsuruyama, and he was able to do everything. He could do storyboards, props, and characters. We ended up using him as a prop designer, and he was really miserable doing that and it was kind of too bad because he was the best person we had on our crew who could draw props, but he hated doing it. Unfortunately, he was just too good at it for us to not make him do that.
How about the backgrounds, man? So it's super unique. You're inventing everything. Was that your is it your hand?
No, I did the backgrounds on the first pilot, but then after that, I hired this architectural designer. He wasn't an architect himself, but he was an architectural illustrator, and so he understood architecture in a way where he would draw a design and it would be something you could actually go out and build, and made perfect sense. You could rotate it, which is, I mean, you could do it very, very easily, without. I mean, I see some background designers, they have to create grids and floor plans and everything. He could just do it off the top of his head. He was amazing that way. Tom McClure is his name.
Here's some of those backgrounds right here, man. Actually, this is an early piece, huh?
Yeah, so that was from the first. So that was mine. So that was from the pilot episode. So for the box set, I cleaned up a lot of the artwork. I cleaned it up digitally because when we did the original show, because we had such a low budget, all of the animation was drawn at a 6 field, which means like literally that size.
Yeah.
A little bit bigger than a storyboard, but the final animation was drawn that size. And so when we had to, when we went to go and publish this stuff for this release, I had to do a lot of digital retouching.
That's really fascinating. I remember seeing my first Bill Plimpton originals, and when he was doing all the animation himself, like with the color pencil joints, and I think they were probably a 6-field.
That surprises me to hear for Eon Flux because of the detail.
Especially,
it seems so detailed.
Yeah, like mountains.
Well, not this stuff. I mean, that was later, but I'm talking about the first pilot episode that we did.
So these pieces, is that your ink line? Is this you?
Yeah. Yeah, that was originally done for the VHS release. That was actually used for... there were 3 VHS tapes that came out, and that was for the second one.
Right, I see. Great colors on these.
Yeah, absolutely stunning. Do you work with MTV to release a set like this box set, or is that something that Waxwork?
No, Waxwork cleared it with MTV, and then I never talked to MTV about it. I just dealt with Waxwork. I mean, they're in the business of approaching studios and networks and getting the rights to the music,
right?
And I guess the artwork for the packaging.
Yeah, it's just gorgeous, man. They really went all out with this stuff. But we were talking some storyboards earlier, and somebody made us a zine of your Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles storyboards for the intro sequence right here. Must have been 85, 86, something like that.
87, 88, probably 87, maybe.
Okay, and
No, you're right. It was before Cops, so must have been 86, 87.
We were talking with Eastman and Laird just a couple of weeks back, and they actually didn't know that you were the guy. They loved Eon Flux, but they didn't know that you did so much work on that show, because beyond this, creating character designs like the Krang body and April O'Neil, like you did so much work on that. Were you a part of Murakami Wolf or a freelancer?
Yeah, I was working for Murakami Wolf. And it's funny because at the time when I took on that job, I just thought, I felt sorry for the toy company, for putting all this money into this ridiculous project, because who the hell was going to watch a show called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles?
It's so funny. So you're the guy storyboarding the intro sequence, super iconic. Was the song completed when you?
Yes. Yeah.
So you had that track to listen to.
Yeah.
And was there any instruction? Is there like a amount of seconds that it needs to take up, or?
Well, you just like with all animation, if you're working from a track, and in an American studio, you're always recording the dialogue first.
Right.
So in the case of this opening title song, they had read the track onto exposure sheets. So what you do is that you write down on an exposure sheet, which has one line for every frame of film, and you show where each syllable hits. And that way you can time out, you can tell that it takes 6 frames to say this one word, and then there's a pause that lasts 4 frames, and then there's another word. So yeah, you're working to that.
And is that your whole instruction, or and then you just use your intuition, like, okay, we need to introduce the characters in a cool way like this when...
Well, the lyrics to the song was introducing the character, so it said, I don't remember the lyrics, it's such a long time ago, but...
Peter, I think you know the lyrics.
No,
sing the song for the people, man. We'll make an NFT of it. It'll go viral. But you see these little instructional pieces, like which turtle is which. Did you create the logo?
No. Okay. I came up with the idea of the logo mutating because I wanted it to reflect the idea of mutants.
Right.
Do you remember responding to those comics, good or bad, Like I assume you got a handful of the Turtles comics whenever it was time to work on something like this.
Yeah, but the comics have almost nothing to do with the TV show. I mean, in terms of the tone or the audience. I mean, this is for kids.
Yeah.
And the comics are not for kids. And so it was just the thing that I didn't understand was that they were turtles, and yet they never retracted into their shells.
Right.
And at first, I had done some drawings of how they were going to pop in and out of their shells. They said, no, they don't do that. And I go, what's the point of them being turtles?
What was your job title for Murakami Wolf? Because if you're doing character designs,
well, it wasn't clear. I was brought on to do character designs, and so I thought that that's what I was a character designer. But then they gave me other stuff to do, like I ended up designing props, and sometimes I designed backgrounds, and then they had me do the opening titles.
Yeah.
So when I saw the show and saw that they credited me as art director, it kind of surprised me.
Did you do other shows for Murakami Wolf? Was Cops through them?
No, Cops was DIC.
Right. And it's funny, like after seeing this and just sort of knowing that you had your hand in it, whenever you watch that intro and you see like the human form of Splinter, like you see Peter Chung's hand in there. You really, really do.
Peter, when you revisit your work from the past like this or Eon Flux, are you critical of that? Or how do you judge that at this stage?
Yeah, you can't help but be critical. I mean, very, very often you have to make compromises, and very often that's all you see is you see the places where you didn't get to do what you wanted to do, and it's something else instead. And fortunately, there isn't a lot of that with Eon Flux, because that was the case where I got to do, at least with the Liquid TV shorts. On the half hours, I can't go back and watch those shows because we had to make so many compromises because we got so many notes from MTV about that.
And there would be a lot of arbitrary sounding stuff too, like the size of knife blades in characters' hands. The guns always have to be in like safe firearm position and things. Can't be pointing guns at people.
Yeah.
And you had there were all kinds of creative ways to point a gun to imply that it's pointing at somebody, but it could never be like both in one frame or something.
Yeah, there was a lot of that. It was like everything that it was, when I first did the first Liquid TV shorts, it was my chance to do something that was completely free of all of those kinds of broadcast standards and practices notes that I used to get work on kids' TVs shows. So I put all of that into the show, and then when people saw that, it focus tested well.
Yeah.
And that's why they ordered the half-hour series. And then when it went to the series, it said, okay, you can't do any of that. Any of the stuff that the focus test groups liked, you weren't allowed to put into the actual show.
Do you think that some of that is a consequence of the Beavis and Butthead fire stuff and kids burning down their houses and trailers and things like that? Because, it's in tandem. Beavis and Butthead was catching fire, and then MTV was catching a lot of hell from Middle America and things.
Well, every network has a standards and practices department where you have people whose sole job is to catch things that they think could cause problems, and that's what their job is. And so they have to justify their job, and so they come up with stuff, which it's just completely capricious. Doesn't have anything to do with anything. It's just one person's gut reaction to something on a particular day.
Right. We know your body of work really well, and I wonder, like, your natural drawing style, is it closer to Eon Flux? Have we seen what your natural drawing style is? What comes closest?
Well, I think about my audience for everything that I do. So if I'm working on a kids show, I'm not trying to, in spite of what people might think, it's like, I'm not trying to push my own way of drawing.
Right.
And I don't think that an artist should be thinking consciously about, trying to draw in their style.
Right.
The idea is weird to me that you would do that. I just draw in the way that feels natural. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it has to do with avoiding things that I don't like to see. For example, there's some artists' work that just for some reason or another, just you have a bad reaction to. And I remember things that I respond negatively to, and try to avoid the same kinds of traits in my own work. So it's sort of like, drawing is very much like walking through a minefield, because there are all these traps that you can fall into that would make your drawing look crappy.
That's so much fun. Before we get out of here, though, and before we turn the cameras on, you mentioned something about digital comics.
Yeah, there's something I wanted to talk about, because I'm really I kind of feel like comics in their printed form is an obsolete medium. I really feel like that. I feel like even when I get a comic book story, I would prefer to read it on my computer screen or on my tablet. I have a tablet that I use to browse and to look at videos, but also to look at comics. And I prefer to do that rather than have a physical book with pages that I have to turn. And I know that people who are into comics consider the layout of the page to be a really critical element in a comic book illustrator's ability to tell a story visually. But to me, it's just something that is born out of a limitation that has to do with the reality of having to publish something in, I don't know how long a comic book is, like 20 pages. And there's no reason to continue to be affected by that limitation, which is completely, imposed on the art form by something that is obsolete in my view. But one thing that always bothered me about when I see comics released in digital form is that they're no better than the printed version. And I have no idea what's going on with digital comics these days, but I always wondered why somebody doesn't put out something like a director's cut version of a comic book, which you could do if you released it digitally. And by that I mean you can read the comic book in its finished version. You can read it in its inked version without colors. You can read it in its pencil-only version. You can read it in its layout version with just the rough pencil layouts. And you could do this very easily in a way that, for example, with DVDs, you used to be able to watch it with a director's commentary track on or off.
Right.
Because the thing is, in the creation of a comic book, all of these different forms of a page exist.
Right.
And yet, the audience is never allowed to appreciate them, because the only thing that gets published is the full color, edited version. And it would just seem to be a very easy thing to do, is release them digitally, in a sense where each page has a set of layers.
Right.
You have the color finished, you have the finished ink, you have the finished pencils, rough pencils. And it would just, I think it would just be a way of attracting more interest to a to the digital form of a comic. I don't understand why people are still buying paper comics, honestly.
Yeah, it has been called a fetish object in the past for sure. But yeah, I think it's listen, we were talking earlier about like let's get those storyboards, like let's get that storyboard book.
But I'm asking you. I mean, since you're much more plugged into what's happening in comics, is anybody doing anything like that? Because I don't understand.
I actually I self-published a book a couple of years ago, October in 1976. It was a blacklight comic, and I released a digital PDF that went with it that had every iteration of it. So like I wrote it on index cards, my very first draft, and I have that. And after that section, I have my script pages, and after that, I have my layouts, and then the pencils, and then inks. Kind of what you're describing in a way. And it's done well for me. I continue to sell those on my website. Comics are a weird market because it's so fragmented. Like we often talk about it, and it's almost like these silos of like you have somebody that says they're a comics fan, but what they do is they buy all Spider-Man books. And then you have another person that's a comics fan, and all they buy is manga, and another comics fan, and they all identify as comics fans, but what they're looking at and getting is very different from person to person. And the American comics market is kind of small, especially if we talk comic books, as opposed to graphic novels. And I think it's just everybody's scraping, to make that work. And if you get into like the comic books as object, and you took that away, you're probably going to take away comic book shops, or, there's a network of stuff that depends on that form that people are invested in, good or bad. It may not make sense. Like you say fetish object, I agree. I think the comic book format is obsolete because it used to be the cheapest format. That's the whole reason we have what we think of as like a comic book. And it's no longer that cheap. We don't even print them on the same presses that we used to print them on when they were pennies to make. And now comic books are $5 or $7 or $10 for a comic book. And it's because they're these specialized objects, but a lot of people are invested in that, and including the readers and the collectors and stuff, on both sides of creating, publishing, distro, selling, and buying. So I don't know. It's strange. I don't know if there's logic. It's probably more legacy and nostalgia that keeps that format.
I was going to say there's a lot of weird tradition wrapped up in comics, just down to the idea of even inking. It's the function that it served was just to kind of aid the color separator. Well, first off, you needed just pure black and white. But the thickness of the lines and using a brush was to give a color separator a little bit of a margin to fuck up the registration and things. We don't have to do that, but we still carry that on as a tradition in a certain ways. That's some stuff I've been thinking about a whole lot in terms of my next projects, of kind of just disabusing myself of like those old methods, because we just don't need them anymore. We have so many more tools at our disposal, and that's a pretty sexy idea that you put forth, man. It's definitely something to consider in a big way.
I taught comics for a while at SVA. I taught visual narrative at SVA and comics. A lot of the people were making comics. And we would do all digital projects, and they would turn them in as 2-page spreads where you're essentially reading like 2 columns on a screen. And there's no reason for the 2 columns. It's a legacy of like, well, it's a book, but it isn't a book. When I'm looking at it on a screen, if it only exists as digital, it's like so bizarre to think I'm going to read this halfway and then go down.
Right.
And then I'm going to go back to the top middle on the right. Like, it is bizarre. It's strange. I don't know what the answer is, but it is definitely odd.
I used to have... I used to think that comics were the best of both worlds in terms of it has the advantage of a text. A traditional book that's written in text, plus the advantages of the visual image of film. But now I've kind of taken an opposite attitude. When I pick up a comic book these days, I kind of feel like I would rather be watching a film, or I'd rather just read a traditional book. In a sense, when I see something in a comic book form, it seems like not the best of both, but in a sense the worst of both. And so...
would you think that way even if you revisited some of Kazuo Umez's work, or some mangaka whose work you dug a lot? Because I've been reading a lot of that stuff lately, and the flow is just, it's so seamless. It's almost like the medium isn't even a consideration while I'm going through it. It's just
there are. You're absolutely right, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think that like Umezu and as far as I'm concerned, the guy who figured it out is Tezuka, and like everything since then. I mean, Tezuka for Japanese for manga, and I would say Jack Kirby for American comics. But as far as I'm concerned, there just hasn't been anything that has been up to that level. And they are adding all of these embellishments. I don't think that the comic book form is suitable to detailed artwork. I think the reason why Kirby and Tezuka's work works so well is that you can just flow through it. You don't have to dwell on any moment because the same sense that I like watching a film, watching animation is its ephemeral quality, and artists like that, they really understand. They're really thinking about the reader's experience as the story is unfolding, more than their experience as an artist needing to get everything down that they want to get down onto the page, which is how I feel about a lot of the later comic book artists. The comic book artists these days just fill panels with as much detail and as much rendering, as much shadows and highlights as they possibly can. And to me, it just interferes with the story being told. So that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, that is the argument.
I'm happy to hear that because we look at so many comics and some of them just I don't connect with. And I think it is a matter of complexity in some cases, like the amount of, it's almost an information density. Mm-hmm. And we often talk about the battle between inkers and colorists, which would be another version of that, where you've got two people or two teams of people doing kind of the same stuff, right? Trying to represent value and texture and all these qualities. And then it's like, okay, let's have the colorist do the same thing. And it's almost too much is happening on that page in a lot of cases. But I don't know. These I love this conversation.
Always good food for thought, man. We always leave a conversation with Peter Chung, man, with some stuff to think about, man, and digest. Peter, is there anything on the horizon? Anything that you could talk about? What are you working on these days? Let's leave the people with some.
Actually, right now I am working on a project, but unfortunately I can't talk about it. I literally can't talk about it because maybe in a few months from now, if we want to. Or a year. By then you'll know.
Come back and talk to us. Come back and talk to us.
But I'm in the thick of a project. Working on something. It's new and it's something I'm very excited about. But I can't talk about it.
Can you talk
great to hear.
Can you talk to the press people? Get us put on the list, man. Let us get the sneak peek so that we could have another conversation and chat it up.
Yeah, and then I'm doing my courses. It's on Project City. So I teach spring semester at USC, and so I've adapted my USC directing course to an online there's an online animation school called projectcity.tv, and you can buy the recordings. Right now it's not in session, so you can buy the recordings of the past the past group. I may be, depending on my current project, I may be starting another group for that. But that's visual directing. It's kind of my own approach to directing film, not just for animation. It could be for live action as well.
What are some bullet points that you cover in the course?
Well, it's divided into. The important thing is that it's divided into two areas of study. One is the form, and the other is the. Well, I don't want to say the content because The storytelling. So by form, I mean by the visual aspect of how you use the camera, how you use design, how you use flow in the way that things edit together. So a lot of that is useful to know regardless of what kind of story you're telling. And then the second part of the course deals with how to engage your audience through the actions of your characters, which is really the more important part of it, but it's something which, I think that is not as it's not as easy to grasp for a lot of students, because it has a lot to do with going against a lot of what you hear as conventional wisdom. So for example, I'll give you one example. So one example that I come across a lot working for studios is that there's a common belief that a character's motivation will be stronger if somebody is compelled to do something. So if they're in a life or death situation, for example, and they have no choice but to do something that's going to make their motivation stronger, that's wrong. So what you should do instead is have your character choose to do something they don't need to do, but they choose to do. And make everything that your character does the result of a choice, of a free choice. And that's always going to make your character stand out more, because the thing is, if somebody's putting a gun to your head and it's making you do something, then anybody in that same situation is going to do the same thing. That's not the way to create a unique or engaging character. What you need to do is you have a character put in a situation where they are free not to do something, but they choose to do it. And that tells you what kind of character, what kind of person they are, and it gets you into understanding what is unique about their motivation. A lot of films that you see, and this happens even in big budget commercial films, I see it all the time, where people think that by putting your hero in a life or death situation, that's enough to generate suspense. And the question of whether or not the character lives or dies is where they locate, the director tends to locate the suspense of, is he going to live or is he going to die? And that's the wrong place to locate the suspense. It's what is your character enabled to do by surviving? That is where you have to locate the suspense. It's not the life or death part. It's what he's going to achieve by surviving, or what is he going to be prevented from achieving by dying. Now, so it's not. Is this clear? What I'm saying?
I'm buying the course. I'm buying the recordings, man.
Yes. Because a lot of people think that if you just put at the end of a conflict and somebody just survives the battle or whatever situation it is, that they've won somehow. But you still leave feeling unsatisfied, because I kind of go, well, whether the character lives or dies is just at the whim of the director. And so you've just flipped a coin and said, okay, he lives. But the fact that he lives doesn't give me any kind of lasting reason to care why he lived. So, one which I might give as an example is if somebody, let's say somebody is falsely accused of doing something that they didn't do, and so they're stuck in a life or death struggle, and so you know that if they die in this battle, that they're gonna die, and everybody is going to think that he's guilty of having done something. And if he survives, then he's able to clear his name and his reputation. That's more important than whether he lives or dies.
Yeah.
So for example, I was shown a pilot by an animator who was trying to pitch a show, and it involved a kid who was fighting some bad guy, some random bad guy, and he was this little kid superhero type of character, and the bad guy was just this big dark villain who was trying to kill him, and so they fight. This pilot, 2-minute piece of animation, was just them fighting, and at the end of it, he survives. And then the artist, he asked me what I thought of it, and I said, okay, so your kid survives, so what? Like why should I care? And he had made the mistake of thinking that whether the character lives or dies was important to the audience. It's not. Don't make that mistake. Okay. That's there's some examples.
I'm sold.
Sounds like something that would be valuable also to comic book artists.
Just storytelling.
Yes,
just storytelling
right.
in general, man. I think it's fantastic. So let's get out of here, man. Don't want to take up too much more of your time, Peter.
Okay.
When this next project is announced, let's reconvene, man, and talk it up.
Okay, yeah.
And sneak us an early copy.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, thanks. I really like what you guys are doing, and I'm very happy that you've made me a part of your project, your ongoing project. So,
man,
I enjoy these dialogues.
You are a storytelling hero of ours, and it is a dream come true to get some FaceTime with you. But don't let us take up too much more of that. Go do your thing. Thank you so much for joining us here on Cartoonist Kayfabe.
Okay, bye guys.